A scared girl, a forgotten dog, a drawing she kept under her pillow. And when her screams finally came, he was already running through the rain. The Ridgeway Animal Shelter was quiet at midnight, the kind of quiet that only comes when the world is sleeping, and even the stray dogs have stopped barking. Rain tapped gently on the metal roof, and the hallway lights flickered, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Somewhere in the back row of kennels, a soft sound broke the silence, a gentle rattle of steel against steel, followed by a low grunt and the squeak of metal straining. Inside Kennel 27, a mangy mixed-breed dog named Toby had wedged his shoulder against the rusted bars. His fur was patchy, tail bent like it had once been broken and never healed quite right. He looked like a dog the world had forgotten. But tonight, his eyes were sharp, burning with something that couldn't be explained. Purpose. He twisted his body, wincing as one shoulder slipped through the gap. The metal scraped against his ribs, but he didn't stop. His back legs kicked hard, and after a final push, he tumbled out and landed on the floor with a grunt. For a moment, he lay still, catching his breath. Then he rose and walked with a limp down the row of kennels, careful not to bark, not to make a sound. Dogs stirred behind bars as he passed, tails wagging softly, noses pressed to cold wire. Toby paused outside the supply closet. He scratched at the doorknob once, twice, then gripped it with his teeth and turned. It took effort. His jaw trembled with the weight of it, but the latch gave way. Inside, shelves lined with leashes, food, and cleaning supplies loomed above him. He sniffed around, ignoring the bags of treats and rows of toys, then nudged aside a mop bucket and pulled something from beneath the shelf. It was a ragged piece of cloth, pink and faded, with a child's name written in marker, Ava. He nosed it gently, inhaled deeply, and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he didn't hesitate. He turned toward the back exit. The fire door was locked from the outside, but Toby had watched the staff use it for 2 years. He knew the rhythm of it, the weakness in the lower hinge. He stood on his hind legs, pushed with his front paws, and after a few tries, the latch gave with a soft metallic click. Cold air rushed in. Rain touched his nose. He stepped out into the night. The security camera above the hallway caught the entire thing. In grainy black and white footage, Toby looked almost ghostly, a shadow of a dog moving with unexpected determination. The timestamp blinked, 12:01 a.m. The next morning, when a tired shelter volunteer named Haley reviewed the footage, her coffee spilled across the desk. "He's not just running," she whispered. "He's going somewhere. No food taken, no accidents left behind, his favorite toy still in his crate. Whatever Toby had gone looking for, it wasn't comfort. It was something else entirely. Something bigger, something urgent." And as the clouds rolled low over Ridgeway and the rain thickened into sheets, a small, silent figure moved through the back streets of town, unseen by headlights, unbothered by fences or noise. Because Toby had made a promise once, and tonight, that promise had finally come due. The wind howled against the windows of the old Victorian house, rattling loose panes and slipping through cracks in the wood. The attic was cold, the kind of cold that settled deep into your bones and made every breath feel like it might freeze. Dust floated in the thin beam of moonlight coming through a broken window pane, and in the far corner, buried beneath a pile of old blankets and worn-out boxes, Ava Winters curled into herself like a question no one wanted to answer. She was 9 years old, but small for her age, all elbows and sharp shoulders, with hair that hung in tangled knots around her face. Her knees were pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tight, chin resting on the edge of a tattered drawing, the only thing she'd saved when she was forced to move in with the Griggs family 2 months ago. The paper was crumpled now, the lines faint from too much folding and holding, but the image was still clear. A dog. Sad brown eyes, crooked tail, a little heart drawn in the corner with a name scribbled underneath in her careful handwriting. Toby. Downstairs, the shouting had started again. Mr. Griggs' voice was loud and slurred, breaking through the walls like thunder. Something crashed, maybe a plate or a lamp, followed by the sharp bark of Mrs. Griggs telling him to sit down before the neighbors called the cops again. Ava squeezed her eyes shut. Her body flinched at every sound, but she didn't cry. She hadn't cried in weeks. Not since the first night she'd locked herself in this crawlspace and promised she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of her tears. Her fingers traced the drawing slowly, as if touching it might bring him closer. She remembered that day at the shelter, how her class had gone on a field trip, how all the other kids had crowded around the puppies and kittens, laughing and shouting, but she hadn't wanted to see the puppies. She'd walked past them, through the rows of barking cages, and found him, sitting in the corner of his kennel, silent, still, like the world had already forgotten him. She had knelt outside his bars and whispered hello. He hadn't barked or jumped or wagged his tail. He had simply looked at her, just looked. And in that one look, she had felt something crack open in her chest, not pain exactly, not sadness, just recognition. He had the same kind of tired in his eyes that she saw in the mirror every morning, like he was still waiting for something good to happen. "You're like me," she'd told him that day. "You don't trust easy." When it was time to leave, she had turned back one last time. Toby hadn't moved, but his eyes had followed her until she was gone. And now, weeks later, when everything felt worse than ever, when the walls seemed to close in tighter each night, she held that drawing like a lifeline. "Toby," she whispered into the dark, her breath fogging the cold air. "I miss you." Somewhere far off, through the attic slats and broken shingles, a low rumble of thunder rolled through the sky. She closed her eyes again, wishing it could carry her away, wishing for something she didn't know how to name. And outside, 10 miles away, a dog with a crooked tail and muddy paws pushed forward through the storm, his nose to the wind, following a scent he could never forget. Toby had never been anyone's first choice. Even as a pup, he hadn't had the floppy charm or the eager bounce that made people stop at the kennel door and say, "That one." His fur was always a little too rough, his ears uneven, and his tail bent in a way that looked painful, but wasn't. He didn't bark when others did, didn't beg for attention, didn't wag his tail like he believed in hope the way other dogs did. Instead, he sat still, eyes quiet, always watching. 2 years ago, he was found wandering near the old train yard on the edge of town. It was winter, the cold biting and cruel, and he had been hiding under a rusted boxcar, ribs showing through his coat, paws bleeding from broken glass. The animal control officer who found him said he hadn't growled or run, just looked at her, like he was already tired of being scared. She wrapped him in a blanket, carried him to the van, and whispered, "You're safe now." But even then, Toby didn't believe it. Safe was just a word. At the shelter, they gave him a name, a cage, and a bowl of food. For weeks, he barely touched it. They thought he was sick, maybe dying, but his heart was strong and his blood tests clean. He was just still. He didn't bark when the others did. He flinched when someone moved too fast or raised their voice, and every now and then, in the quiet hours after dark, they'd find him sitting at the far edge of his kennel, staring out the window like he was waiting for someone he couldn't quite remember. They tried to place him 3 different times. The first home lasted a week, a couple with loud voices and louder footsteps. They returned him, saying he wouldn't play, wouldn't cuddle, just paced the yard like a ghost and growled when they tried to leash him. The second home lasted 3 days, a single man who worked nights and thought a quiet dog would be easy. But Toby tore through the screen door on the first thunderstorm and was found the next morning 10 miles away, soaked, curled under a tree. The third was a family with 2 kids and a fenced backyard. They wanted to give him a chance, they said. But on day 5, Toby slipped the gate and vanished. He came back that night, muddy and tired, like nothing had happened. Still, the parents said no more. "He's not right," they told the shelter. "Something's off." So he returned to Ridgeway. His file got thicker, his chances smaller. But no one could say he was dangerous, just strange, just searching. And yet, the staff began to notice something. He always escaped with purpose. He never wandered aimlessly. He picked directions and stayed with them. When they pulled up camera footage from the neighborhood, they saw the same thing every time. Toby running like he knew exactly where he was going, even when there was nothing there, like a soldier walking a route only he remembered. Some thought he was looking for a home he'd lost. Others joked he was chasing ghosts. But one volunteer, Haley, watched him one night after closing, sitting in his kennel, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the moonlight outside. "He's waiting," she said softly, crouching by his cage. "I don't know who, and I don't know why, but he's not lost. He's just not done yet." And now, as the storm picked up outside and the streets grew slick with rain, Toby moved with that same quiet urgency. His legs ached, his pads were sore, but he didn't stop. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward her. The bus had arrived with a screech of brakes and a flood of excited voices. Fourth graders spilled out onto the sidewalk, chattering and bouncing with the kind of energy only a school field trip could bring. The Ridgeway Animal Shelter wasn't a flashy place, just a long building tucked between a gas station and a quiet stretch of woods. But today it felt like a playground. Puppies barked behind glass, cats meowed from carpeted towers, and the volunteers smiled wide, ready to show the kids how kindness could start with a leash and a treat. Ava stepped off the bus last. She kept her backpack hugged close and stayed near the edge of the group, her eyes flicking from the noisy boys chasing each other to the girls giggling over the tiniest Chihuahua puppy. She didn't speak. She didn't reach for the cookies they handed out. She just looked around slowly, like she was trying to find a reason to be there at all. Inside, the shelter buzzed with noise. Kids pressed their faces to the glass, laughing when a golden retriever puppy licked the window. One girl squealed when a fluffy kitten batted at her shoelace. Teachers took photos, volunteers explained the adoption process, and no one noticed the quiet girl slipping away from the group. Ava walked down the narrow hallway of older dog kennels, past barking pit mixes, nervous labs, and tired mutts who barely lifted their heads. She didn't stop until she reached the last kennel on the left. The nameplate said, Toby. No breed listed, just male, approximately. 4 to 5 years. Mixed inside sat a dog unlike any of the others. He didn't bark, didn't move. He lay with his head resting between his front paws, his eyes half open, his tail motionless. Ava crouched slowly, her knees popping as she lowered herself to the floor in front of the kennel. She pressed her hand to the cold metal bars. Toby didn't look at her. For a long time, they just stayed like that. One girl, one dog, separated by steel and silence. Ava didn't call to him. She didn't whistle or pat the floor like other kids had. She just waited, her fingers resting lightly against the metal. Finally, Toby lifted his head. His eyes found hers, brown, cloudy at the edges, but sharp underneath. He studied her with a kind of quiet that most people missed, but Ava understood. Slowly, as if testing the moment, he stood and walked to the front of the kennel. He lowered his nose and pressed it gently to her fingers. Ava didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed. "You're like me," she whispered. "You don't trust easy." Behind her, the rest of the class called out about cute puppies and funny names. But Ava didn't move, and neither did Toby. For those few minutes, everything else faded. The shouting that usually filled her nights, the teachers who didn't look too close, the houses that never really felt like home. Toby blinked slowly, his nose still resting against her fingers. Ava leaned forward just a little and said, "It's okay. I get it." When the teacher finally found her and said it was time to go, Ava didn't argue. She stood up, brushing dust from her jeans, and looked back one last time. Toby had returned to his corner, lying down again, but his eyes were open now, watching her go. She turned and walked away, but in her pocket, she kept the drawing she'd made during art class that morning, a sketch of a dog with a crooked tail and quiet eyes. She had written his name at the top in black crayon. Toby. And from that day on, she never went to sleep without it under her pillow. The morning after Toby disappeared, the Ridgeway Animal Shelter was in quiet chaos. The usual routines, feeding, walking, cleaning, were paused as staff gathered around the tiny black and white monitor in the break room. The grainy footage played on a loop, over and over again, showing the same strange sequence of events. Toby, the dog who hardly moved during the day, who didn't bark or beg or cause trouble, slipping through the bars of his kennel like smoke, opening a door with his teeth and vanishing out the fire exit like he had done it 100 times before. He didn't just wander, Mr. Delgado muttered, arms crossed over his chest. He was the manager of Ridgeway, a man in his 50s with tired eyes and a voice that was usually calm, but not this morning. "He's not just running," he said again, this time louder. "He's going somewhere." "Should we call animal control?" one of the newer volunteers asked, worry creasing her forehead. "He's probably scared." Lost. "He didn't look scared," Haley said softly from the corner. She was the one who'd spent the most time with Toby. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She always said he reminded her of an old soldier, quiet, worn, but not broken. He looked like he had a reason. Delgado turned to her, nodding. "Exactly. Did he ever act like this before? Try to escape?" "No," she said. "He was smart, sure, but he stayed put. Until now." They rewound the video again, watching as Toby sniffed a cloth from the supply closet before heading for the door. "What was that?" one staff member asked. "A piece of fabric," Haley replied. "Pink. Looked like it had something written on it." Delgado narrowed his eyes. "We need to figure out what set him off." A long silence stretched between them until Haley finally spoke again. "There was a girl," she said slowly. "About 3 weeks ago. School field trip. She sat with him longer than anyone I've ever seen." Delgado looked up. "You remember her name?" "Ava," she said. "Ava Winters. Quiet kid. Didn't talk much, but she and Toby, they just sat together, like they already knew each other." Delgado walked over to the office computer and started typing. "Let's see if we can find her. Maybe she adopted him or something." Haley shook her head. "No, she didn't have anyone. She said she was in foster care. I think it was a temporary placement. She told Toby goodbye, like it was for good." Delgado frowned as he scrolled through records. There's nothing recent under her name. No adoption files, no follow-ups. If she was placed, the county would have handled it, not us. "So where is she?" Haley asked. No one answered. The sound of the video looping in the background filled the room again, Toby escaping, pausing once to sniff the cloth, then vanishing into the storm. Mr. Delgado ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I don't like this." "What if he's looking for her?" Haley whispered. "What if something's wrong?" He stared at the screen. "Then we've got more than a missing dog on our hands." Outside, the clouds hung low over Ridgeway, heavy with rain. Somewhere out there, Toby was moving with purpose, nose to the wind, heart thudding with every step. And back at the shelter, the people who had once called him a stray began to wonder if maybe they'd missed something. Something big. Something they should have seen coming. The storm hit harder as the night dragged on, turning the streets of Ridgeway into rivers of mud and headlights. Rain came in sheets, thick and cold, slamming against windows and flooding gutters. Most dogs would have looked for shelter, a dry porch, maybe a carport to crawl under. But Toby didn't stop. His paws slapped against wet pavement, his fur soaked straight through, clinging to his ribs. Every few steps, he limped, the old injury in his hind leg flaring up again. But still he pressed on. The world blurred around him. Blasts of thunder cracked overhead, lightning flashing across rooftops, illuminating his crooked shape for only seconds at a time. Tires hissed past, horns honked. But Toby stayed low, weaving through alleyways and backlots like he was built for it. He didn't flinch at the noise, didn't stop for scraps, didn't stray from the path only he could sense. There was something pulling him, something he couldn't explain. Not just smell, though the girl's scent still clung to the scrap of cloth he'd found. Not just memory, though her voice echoed in the quiet corners of his mind. It was something else. Deeper. When a pack of coyotes blocked his path near the train yard, he didn't challenge them. He didn't need to. He kept his head down, shoulders tight, eyes steady. They growled, watched him pass, but didn't follow. It was like even they understood. He wasn't prey. He wasn't a threat either. He was on a mission, and nothing that moved on 4 legs was going to stop him. The houses changed as he crossed town. Fences grew taller, lawns unkempt, porches covered in junk and broken furniture. These were the forgotten edges of Ridgeway, the kind of streets no one talked about, but everyone knew existed. Toby had been here once, a long time ago, before the train yard, before the cage. Something about the broken fences and peeling paint felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream. He paused under a sagging porch, chest heaving, ears twitching. The rain had soaked him through, his coat heavy, every breath rattling. But then he lifted his nose and sniffed. There. Faint, but real. Her. He limped toward the tall gray house at the end of the block, the one with vines creeping up the siding and a single flickering light in the attic window. He circled the backyard once, sniffing along the fence line before he found the door. Old, warped, with peeling paint and rusty hinges. He lifted one paw and scratched. Soft at first, then again, harder. The sound barely rose above the rain. Inside, no one stirred. He scratched again. No answer. A flash of lightning lit the yard, followed by a boom that shook the windows. Toby stood still, his ears back, his tail low but steady. Then, after one last look at the door, he turned away and slipped into the shadows. He didn't leave. Not really. He curled beneath a broken porch swing just out of sight, nose resting on muddy paws, eyes fixed on the door. He had found her, and he wasn't going anywhere. The storm had settled into a steady drumbeat by the time midnight came again. Rain tapped the rooftop in slow, heavy rhythms, and thunder rolled in the distance like a threat too tired to yell. Inside the old house, everything creaked. The walls, the floors, the pipes, all of it sounded alive in the dark. But it wasn't the storm that kept Ava awake. It was the footsteps. She heard them long before they reached the attic stairs. Heavy, slow, dragging with the weight of too much drink and too little care. Mr. Griggs was awake, and he was angry again. Ava curled deeper into the crawl space, her blanket pulled tight around her knees, her drawing of Toby clutched to her chest. Her breath came shallow and quick, eyes wide in the dark. The wood above her head groaned. Then the footsteps grew louder. The attic door slammed open with a crash, followed by the thud of boots climbing, slow and mean. She held her breath. Maybe he'd just yell. Maybe he'd go away. But the crawl space door rattled. "Ava!" he barked, voice thick and sharp. "You hiding again, you little brat?" She didn't answer. Couldn't. Then the door tore open. The dim light from the attic spilled in. Mr. Griggs's shadow filled the opening, his hand reaching forward like a claw. "I told you not to lock this again," he growled. Ava screamed. Not loud enough to shake the walls, not loud enough for the neighbors, but loud enough to split the silence in two. And before Griggs could take a single step closer, there was a sound like thunder, not from the sky, but from the hallway behind him. A snarl, low and deep, like it came from the earth itself. Then movement, fast, wild, unstoppable. Toby hit him like a hammer. No bark, no warning. Just a flash of wet fur, a crooked tail, and jaws that knew exactly what they were doing. He launched from the attic doorway, teeth sinking into Griggs's ankle with a force that buckled the man's knees. Griggs roared in pain, stumbling back, swinging wildly. But Toby held on. The dog's body shook with the effort, his eyes locked, focused, full of something stronger than rage, purpose. Ava didn't wait. She scrambled out of the crawl space, her bare feet hitting the floor with a soft slap. She darted around the fight, her heart pounding so hard she couldn't hear anything else. Down the attic stairs she flew, gripping the railing, skipping steps, breath catching in her throat. Behind her she heard another scream, then a crash, then silence. But she knew Toby was coming. She didn't look back. Down one flight, then another, until she reached the front door. It stuck, like it always did, but she threw her shoulder into it, and it opened with a groan. Cold air hit her face. Rain fell in heavy curtains. Then she heard it, paws on wood, nails clicking on the stairs. Toby. He burst through the hallway like a storm himself, his fur soaked, eyes burning bright. He didn't slow as he caught up to her. He just ran beside her, through the door, into the yard, into the dark. Ava didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. She only knew she wasn't alone. And somewhere behind them, Mr. Griggs howled with pain, yelling curses into the storm, too slow to follow, too stunned to try. The girl had escaped. Because a dog had heard her scream. The rain hadn't let up, but Ava didn't stop. Her feet were raw, her nightgown soaked and clinging to her skin. But she ran like the night itself was chasing her. Every step burned, every breath was ragged, but Toby was right behind her, his body moving on instinct, limping but determined. The streetlights flickered above them, and the houses all looked the same, dark, sleeping, unaware. She didn't know where she was going until she saw the old yellow house with the porch swing, the one where the lady with the garden gnomes always smiled at her in passing. She climbed the steps 2 at a time and pounded on the door with both fists. "Please," she cried, voice thin and shaky. "Please open. Help me." Behind her, Toby stood still at the bottom of the steps, dripping wet, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. His legs trembled, blood trailing from a wound near his side, but he didn't make a sound. He just kept his eyes on her, like he couldn't rest until he knew she was safe. A light flicked on inside, then another. The door opened a crack, then all the way. Mrs. Kramer stood in her robe, one hand over her heart. "Ava?" she asked, confused, then saw the dog behind her. "Oh, dear Lord." Ava collapsed into her arms, sobbing. "He saved me," she whispered through her tears, pointing at Toby. "He came for me. He bit him. He saved me." The woman held her tight and shouted over her shoulder, "Call 911. Now." Sirens came fast after that. Red and blue lights filled the street, cutting through the storm. Police cars, an ambulance, then a child protective services van. Voices called out, questions flew, but Ava couldn't keep up. She just stayed wrapped in the blanket someone gave her, sitting on Mrs. Kramer's couch, shaking and wet, her eyes locked on the dog who hadn't moved since they arrived. Toby stood for as long as he could, but as soon as he saw Ava sit down, as soon as her shoulders stopped shaking, something in him gave way. His legs folded beneath him, and he slumped to the porch floor with a soft grunt. "Dog down," someone called. 2 paramedics rushed over, kneeling beside him. One checked his pulse, the other reached for gauze. Puncture wound on the side, possible broken leg. This boy's been through it. A young medic, not much older than 20, brushed rain from Toby's face and whispered gently, "You're a good boy. You did real good." They lifted him carefully onto a stretcher, wrapped in dry towels, his head lolled to the side, eyes half open. Ava saw it happen through the window and scrambled off the couch, pulling free from the adults who tried to hold her back. "Wait," she called, barefoot on the porch again. The medic paused at the ambulance door. "I need to say goodbye," she said, her voice barely a breath. The man nodded and stepped aside. Ava leaned over, pressed her hand to Toby's muddy fur, and whispered, "You found me. I don't know how, but you did. I love you, Toby." The stretcher slid into the ambulance, and the doors shut with a soft click. The siren didn't wail. It didn't need to. The lights spun silently as the van pulled away into the rain. Back at the Winters house, police walked out with Mr. Griggs in handcuffs. His face was twisted in rage, but no one listened to him. The truth was out now, and no one was ever going to let him near Ava again. Because a girl had run, because a dog had followed, and because love, when it's real, always finds a way. The veterinary hospital smelled like antiseptic and coffee, the kind of place where tired people whispered in corners and machines beeped softly behind closed doors. Toby lay on a metal table under a blanket, his fur matted with blood and rain, his breathing shallow. One of his ribs was cracked. A deep gash ran along his flank, and his back paw was swollen, likely from glass or metal. But his eyes, though heavy, stayed open. He kept lifting his head, just enough to glance around, just enough to make sure the girl wasn't too far away. In the next room, Ava sat on a chair wrapped in a dry towel, her legs swinging, hair still damp. A nurse had given her cocoa and crackers, but she hadn't touched them. All she cared about was the dog on the other side of the wall. Every now and then she looked up at the door, hoping someone would come tell her he was going to be okay. In the operating room, the vet worked quickly, cleaning wounds and stitching what she could. A tech ran the microchip scanner across Toby's neck. It beeped once, then brought up a number on the screen. Nothing unusual at first, just a string of digits and a date of entry. But then a note popped up in red, one no one at Ridgeway Shelter had ever seen. The tech frowned. Doc? You're going to want to look at this." The vet leaned in, her gloves stained red. She read the note once, then again. Recovered from a warehouse raid. Possible abuse survivor. Evidence in sealed file. Contact Ridgeway County Records. She straightened up and pulled off her gloves. Call Officer Janice Morrow. Now. Officer Morrow arrived 20 minutes later. She was tall, quiet, and carried a notebook in her pocket instead of her phone. She was already handling Ava's case, the reports, the removal from the Winters house, the emergency placement into temporary care, but the microchip note changed everything. She met the vet in the hallway, her expression unreadable. "Warehouse raid?" she repeated. The vet nodded. 2 years ago, before he ever showed up at the shelter. That note was buried in the chip registry, flagged, but sealed. No one saw it. "I need the chip number," Morrow said, "and everything you've got." Back at her cruiser, she pulled up the database and searched the code. It took a few minutes, but when the file opened, her eyes narrowed. Photos, reports, court documents. A warehouse on the edge of town used for illegal breeding, possibly worse. One of the dogs rescued had a crooked tail and deep scars. That dog was Toby. Her fingers hovered over the screen. "He was a witness," she whispered. "He saw things." She printed the file, clipped it to Ava's report, and sat back in the cruiser thinking. This wasn't just a case of a brave dog protecting a child. It was bigger. Toby had escaped before. He had run from something once, only to find himself locked in a cage with no one who understood him. But then he met Ava. And somehow she brought it all back, whatever he'd been through, whoever he'd lost. She lit a spark he'd been carrying for years, waiting for the moment it would mean something again. Officer Morrow looked back toward the hospital doors, where Ava waited and Toby fought to stay awake. "They saved each other," she murmured. "Now it's our turn." The warehouse sat at the far edge of town, half swallowed by weeds and shadows. Its metal walls were rusted, windows shattered, and the roof sagged like it was tired of standing. No one had been there in years, not since the raid that brought in more than a dozen abused dogs and shut down an operation no one had seen coming. But the stains hadn't left. The memories still lingered in the concrete, in the broken chains bolted to the floor, in the claw marks on the doors. Officer Janice Morrow stepped out of her cruiser and stood in the silence for a moment. The wind was sharp, blowing dust and dead leaves through the open bay doors. She took out her flashlight, though the sun was still up, and crossed the threshold. Her boots echoed through the empty space, each step bouncing off the walls. The reports had described it all: illegal breeding, over a dozen dogs in cramped cages, no light, no clean water. Most were malnourished, scarred, afraid of people. Some hadn't survived. But there had been one dog, the file said, who didn't cower, who didn't bite or whimper or hide. He just sat, quiet and still, eyes locked on the officers as if he'd been waiting. Toby. Janice stopped at the far corner where his cage had once been. The bars were gone now, but the cement slab where his food bowl had been was still stained. She knelt, running her fingers along the cold floor, and thought about the microchip file. There had been evidence that the operation had ties to something deeper. Names that disappeared from paperwork. charges that were dropped before they reached court. It hadn't made sense back then, but now one name kept showing up again and again. William Griggs. She stood and flipped open the folder in her hand. There it was. Griggs as a silent partner in the property records, using a fake name but the same contact number that matched his foster license. And he'd been assigned Ava, a child no one had looked too closely at, because she didn't complain, didn't cry, didn't act out. She just disappeared into the system, the same way Toby had. Janice's stomach twisted. It wasn't chance. It wasn't fate. It was a circle closing. Toby hadn't just protected Ava out of instinct. He had remembered. Somehow, from the moment he saw her at the shelter, he knew. Knew the smell, the house, the man. Maybe not in the way people did, but deep down in the part of him that never forgot the cold floor, the dark cage, the voice that used to yell in the dark. And when she was taken into that same house, something in him woke up. Something that said not again. Not her. Janice turned off her flashlight and stepped back outside. The wind had picked up. Clouds were rolling in again. She looked back at the warehouse, then toward town, where a girl was finally safe and a dog was fighting for his life. Toby hadn't just escaped. He had come back to finish what was started, and this time Janice would make sure the ending was different. The courtroom was cold and too big, the kind of place where even a whisper could echo for miles. Ava sat in the witness chair, legs dangling above the floor, her hands clutching the sleeves of her cardigan like they might help her stay still. She wore a simple dress and clean shoes, but her eyes looked older than they should have. She didn't look at the man sitting across from her. She couldn't. William Griggs sat at the defense table, his expression blank, his suit too neat for the monster she remembered. But Ava wasn't alone. Janice Morrow sat just behind her, hands folded, watching with quiet strength. The judge adjusted his glasses. The jury leaned in. Ava's social worker gave her an encouraging nod. The prosecutor stepped forward and asked gently, "Ava, can you tell us what happened the night you ran away?" Her voice trembled at first. She talked about the attic, the crawl space, the yelling. She talked about the fear, the hiding, the sound of footsteps that never meant anything good. She spoke slowly, carefully, but the room listened like every word mattered. Because it did. She told them about the times she didn't eat, the times she had bruises, the lies she was told so she wouldn't tell anyone. But when the prosecutor asked about that night, when everything changed, her voice broke. She looked down at her hands. Her bottom lip shook. "I wanted to scream," she whispered, "but I didn't think anyone would come." The room was silent. Then the back door opened. Heads turned. And in stepped Toby. He walked beside a vet tech, a soft leash clipped to his collar. His tail hung low, his movements careful. Bandages still wrapped his side, but his eyes were clear, focused. He walked straight toward the front of the courtroom and stopped beside the witness stand. Ava gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. The tears came fast, but not from fear. She reached out, fingers brushing his fur. He leaned into her, pressing his head against her arm. She looked up at the jury. "He came for me," she said. Her voice was stronger now, steady and full of truth. "He found me." He remembered. I don't know how, but he knew. And when I screamed, he saved me. Someone in the gallery sniffled. A reporter wiped his eyes. One of the jurors reached for a tissue. Toby didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stood there, like a soldier standing guard. The judge cleared his throat. The prosecutor rested her hand on the table. The defense tried to object, but no one listened anymore. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, Ava held onto Toby's neck, her face buried in his fur. The courtroom erupted in applause, quiet at first, then louder, until the judge gave up trying to quiet the room. Even he was smiling. William Griggs was led away in handcuffs, his head down. No one clapped for him. But when Toby turned to walk out, limping slightly, the crowd stood. Because heroes come in all shapes. And some walk on four legs. The day Toby was adopted didn't start with parades or fireworks. It began with sunlight pouring through the hospital window, warm and gentle, and the quiet hum of machines fading into the background. Ava sat cross-legged on the floor beside his recovery bed, a book in her lap, but her eyes were on him. Toby was awake now, sitting upright for the first time in days, his crooked tail giving the smallest of thumps when she smiled at him. Officer Janice Morrow entered the room with a leash in one hand and a wide grin on her face. "Well," she said, crouching beside the bed, "the paperwork's done. He's yours now." Ava looked up slowly, as if she wasn't sure she'd heard right. "Really?" "Really," Janice said. "You're officially his person. No more shelters. No more cages." Toby gave a soft huff, as if he understood every word. The shelter threw a small celebration that afternoon. They put up paper signs and brought out cupcakes. Staff and volunteers gathered around as Ava hugged Toby, his new collar shiny and blue, his name etched into the tag like a promise. News crews came, cameras rolling, microphones shoved forward as they asked questions about bravery and miracles. But Ava didn't say much. She just held Toby close and said, "He's my best friend." That night, they went home. Not back to the gray house with the broken attic, but to a different place, warm, lived in, with creaky stairs and mismatched rugs. Her new foster family was kind, quiet, patient. They didn't ask too many questions. They gave Ava her own room and Toby his own bed, though he never used it. He curled up on the floor beside hers instead, like always, like he was still standing guard. Outside, the backyard was wide and wild. No fences yet, just a stretch of overgrown grass, a few fruit trees, and an old garden that needed tending. Ava didn't care. She ran through it barefoot, laughing, her hair flying behind her, as Toby chased her in circles, his tail wagging like it hadn't in years. He still limped now and then, but it didn't slow him down. Not when she was near. The couch inside had a torn cushion from when he'd tried to climb up too fast. The floors had muddy paw prints from the rain, but no one scolded him. No one complained. At night, Ava would fall asleep with one hand in his fur, her breathing soft, steady. Sometimes she'd talk to him before bed, her voice quiet in the dark. "You're not just a dog," she'd whisper. "You're my family." Toby never answered, but he didn't have to. His body stayed close, warm, solid, and every time she stirred in her sleep, he was there. Because some dogs don't come into our lives by accident. Some show up broken and scarred with memories too heavy to carry alone. But they stay. They protect. They heal in their own way. Toby had run through rain, through fear, through everything the world tried to throw at him. Not for food, not for safety, not for praise. He ran for her. Because he remembered. Because he refused to let her face the darkness alone. And now, at last, the house was quiet. Not the kind of silence that hurts, but the kind that feels like peace. Ava's laughter still echoed through the garden. Toby's paws thumped behind her, and the sun dipped low over the horizon like it had been waiting for this moment all along. They were home, and they were safe. Thank you for watching this video of A Dog's Devotion. If you like this story, show your support with a like, and join us by subscribing for more inspiring stories like this one.